Thank you so much for joining us here tonight for the Burkett Miller Distinguished Lecture Series hosted by the Scott L. Probasco Distinguished Chair of Free Enterprise. I would like to thank our Probasco Chair, Dr. Claudia Williamson Kramer, our campus leadership, the UC Foundation, and the Probasco Subcommittee of the Foundation for their engagement and support of this event. The Burkett Miller Distinguished Lecture Series is an annual event that brings notable scholars, practitioners, and thinkers to the UTC campus to address topics critical to understanding the market economy. Past lectures have included a number of Nobel laureates, well-known economists, and world leaders, and we are thrilled to have Dr. Peter Boettke as our speaker this evening. The Probasco Chair of Free Enterprise was established in 1977 by an initial bequest from the estate of Burkett Miller and is among the largest endowed chairs of free enterprise in the nation. The mission of the chair is to study the American free enterprise system and the conditions under which it operates most efficiently, to engage in high-level scholarly research, and to contribute to the public knowledge and understanding of economics theory and practice. The Probasco Chair also directs the Center for Economic Education and serves as a tenured faculty member in the Department of Finance and Economics in the Rollins College of Business and teaches courses at the graduate and undergraduate levels. Before coming to UTC, Dr. Williamson Kramer most recently served as Associate Professor of Economics and the Drew Allen Endowed Fellow at Mississippi State University. She was also co-director of the Institute for Market Studies at Mississippi State. Her main research interests lie at the intersection of applied economic development and political economy. She has authored more than 40 articles in referee journals, including the Journal of Law and Economics, World Development, Journal of Comparative Economics, Public Choice, Journal of Corporate Finance, and others. She has co-edited 2 books, contributed multiple chapters to edited books, written book reviews, and policy briefs. Her research has also appeared in popular press outlets such as The Economist and the BBC. At the undergraduate level, Dr. Williamson Kramer primarily teaches principles of microeconomics. She has taught doctoral seminars in economics for managers in the MBA program, international economic development at the undergraduate level, and co-taught a doctoral seminar on insider trading. She has also served as a coordinator for the PhD program in economics. She currently serves on the editorial board of Public Choice and on the Association of Private Enterprise Education Executive Committee. In addition, she has served on the nominating committee to the Southern Economic Association. In 2014, she was appointed to a 2-year term to serve on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights Mississippi Advisory Committee. A native of West Virginia, Dr. Williamson Kramer earned her BBA in economics in 2004 from Marshall University, summa cum laude, and with university honors. She completed her PhD in economics at West Virginia University in May 2008. She spent the 2007-2008 year at George Mason University as the F.A. Hayek Visiting Scholar in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. She was a postdoctoral fellow at the Development Research Institute of New York University from 2009 to 2012, and she spent the 2008-2009 year as an assistant professor of economics at Appalachian State University. During the summer of 2007, she performed field work on land titling in rural Peru. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Claudia Williamson Kramer.
Thank you, Michael. That was way too much time spent on my bio. So now we're going to turn to introducing our distinguished speaker, Dr. Peter Boettke. Dr. Boettke is a university professor of economics and philosophy at George Mason University, where he is also director of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics, and the BB&T professor for the study of capitalism at the Mercatus Center. Pete has developed a robust political economy research program that expands our understanding of how individuals acting through the extended market order can promote freedom and prosperity in our society. His analytical framework is strongly influenced by the paradigm of Austrian economics, as well as other intellectual traditions personified by thinkers such as Adam Smith, F.A. Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, James Buchanan, and Eleanor Ostrom. Pete has authored and co-authored several books on topics ranging from the collapse of socialism in the former Soviet Union to institutional analysis and development. His most recent book, F.A. Hayek, Economics, Political Economy, and Social Philosophy, explores the life and work of the Austrian-British economist, political economist, social philosopher, as well as his impact on academia. As a teacher, Pete is dedicated to cultivating enthusiasm for the economic way of thinking and the importance of economic ideas in future generations of scholars and citizens. And I can vouch for that, as I am one of his students. And as was mentioned in my lengthy bio, one of the things that I had the opportunity of doing while I was a grad student at West Virginia was coming over to George Mason and being mentored by him and other faculty there, and that was all spearheaded by Pete. And we are extremely grateful for the program that he has built there, but it goes beyond the walls of George Mason and expands to really anyone who cares to listen, think, and talk to Pete about these wonderful ideas. He has earned several distinctions, including the Golden Dozen Award for Excellence in Teaching from the College of Arts and Sciences at New York University and the Mason Alumni Association's 2009 Faculty Member of the Year Award. Pete's contributions to the field of economics have been recognized with several prestigious awards, including the Adam Smith Award from the Association of Private Enterprise Education and the Charles Koch Distinguished Alumnus Award from the Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University. We are honored to have Pete here with us today to share his insights and expertise. So please join me in welcoming him to the stage.
Thank you very much, Claudia, for that. And I think you guys here are very fortunate to have Claudia here as the Probasco Chair. She's an outstanding economist and educator, and she's also one of the best persons you could have in this job, and full trust in her. So I'm really thrilled to get a chance to come down here and give a talk and to see the program she's building and the life she's building here. So this is great. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about capitalism and socialism and our future. Like in a lot of things, current events sometimes catch your imagination. I already decided that I was going to talk on this, and then last weekend I was watching Sunday Morning, which I like to watch, and then right after Sunday Morning comes Face the Nation. And then all of a sudden on Face the Nation, they decided to have Bernie Sanders talk, and they gave him 10 minutes without a single critical question asked to him about his most recent book, which is Why It's Okay to Be Angry About Capitalism. And so I sat there and I listened to it and everything like that. And, besides wanting to throw my shoe at the TV, I decided that's not a good response. I actually have to wonder, why is it that his message is resonating with people, and especially young people? And what I'm going to try to do today is explain why that might be the case and how economic knowledge is our best antidote to that, and the kind of scholarship and teaching that Claudia represents in her work is actually going to be the way that we can effectively try to counter it. So anyway, that's a lot of points on this paragraph here. All right, so these are the main points I hope to get across in my discussion. One of them is that the science of economics co-evolved with liberal institutions of governance. So one of the founders of the Scottish Enlightenment, a philosopher named David Hume, in his book called A Treatise on Human Nature, argues that we can't even have society unless we have institutions of property, contract, and consent. That is stability of possession, transference of that possession by contract, and the keeping of promises. Now, you can all just do the thought experiment of what a world would look like if there wasn't stability in possession, that there wasn't transfer by consent. Instead, you could just bop someone over the head and take whatever you want. Or there wasn't keeping of promises. I make a deal with you and then I don't honor it, right, idea. So Hume argued that unless we have those things, we're not going to even be able to get society off the ground. The institutions of a market economy are grounded in those three ideas of property, contract, and consent. That's how it is that individuals are able to pursue specialization in production and realize peaceful social cooperation through mutually beneficial exchange. One of the things that's most fascinating about economic relationships is both parties walk away saying thank you. Right? It's a mutually beneficial exchange. In fact, I just shook hands, right? The term in Greek for exchange is katalactics. And if you look at the original source of the lettering, the K is two people shaking hands. Because what's going on, it also means, by the way, turning a stranger into a friend, the term catalaxy, which is actually what goes on in markets. So the science of economics evolved with the liberal institutions of governance: private property, freedom of contract, the rule of law. All right, the second thing is that economic calculation debate not only demonstrates a fundamental flaw in the socialist project, but highlighted the functional significance of property prices and loss, property prices and profit and loss in the operation of economic liberalism, capitalism. And so I'm going to sort of stress that. The arguments made by economists in their critique of socialist aspirations are as relevant today as they were when they were first made. That is to focus on the role of property rights in incentivizing individual decision makers and serving as the foundation of exchange, the role of prices in guiding production activity and exchange activity to pursue productive specialization and peaceful social cooperation, the role of profit in luring economic decision makers towards economic ventures, and losses in disciplining us. It's very important to always remember it's a profit and loss system. This is why the market is a great regulator of market activity. Right? It regulates by, if you pursue an activity that generates losses, you lose your decision power. Okay? So you've been regulated by the market. That's the strongest discipline that the market has. And so we always have to, it's never no regulation or, lots of regulation. It's who's to do the regulating. Right? And so, my favorite economist of all time is a man named Ludwig von Mises, and he said that it all turns on the buying and abstaining from buying of the consumers that's going to dictate all of this. So, and the role of politics, law, and society is always involved in the framing of the environment within which economic activity takes place. There's no such thing as an economic vacuum. So we're always talking about social arrangements. We're always talking about society. Okay. Ideas have consequences, and economic science matters. So this is the very last paragraph of Ludwig von Mises's treatise called Human Action. And all I want to do is emphasize the last paragraph here, which is that you can either take or leave the teachings of economics, but that doesn't preclude you from experiencing the consequences of your decision of that. So we can preclude the teachings of economics, but the consequences of that are going to be quite dire for human civilization. And so economic science matters. It is a science with every bit as much the status of any of the other sciences that hold that position. That doesn't mean, by the way, we should always, quote unquote, trust the science. It means that science needs to be constantly contested. One of the great scientists of the 20th century, Richard Feynman, summarized what the scientific attitude is in the following way. He said, never worry about asking a question that can't be answered. Always fear an answer that can't be questioned. So if someone tells you you can't question their answer because it's the science, that's the opposite of science. Just always remember that. Science is an evolving, constantly contested enterprise. And so that's the only thing that we can do is continually submit our ideas again and again to our peers. All right, so this is my point. This is a book by Lionel Robbins. Lionel Robbins is a great economist that was the department chairman at the London School of Economics at a very young age. He decided to build the London School of Economics into this great center of economic research and education. He was only 29 years old when he took over his department chairmanship. And one of his first recruits was to bring Friedrich Hayek from Vienna to teach at the London School of Economics. And between 1930 and 1950, they built this major center of economic education. It's important to remember that at that time, the United States was backward in terms of education. Our top universities were more like finishing schools than they were research schools. The real research orientation of the United States took place after World War II. and in particular with the development of the GI Bill and the investment in higher education and everything that took place. Prior to that, basically there were some researchers at Chicago and Johns Hopkins, which was the first major research university really, but pretty much like Harvard was like Mr. Chips, with like, tweed jackets and, little patches on their thing. And like in Back to School, this is an audience that's more my age. So you might remember this when Rodney Dangerfield played in the movie Back to School, and they had the professor that was the economics professor in there. And, he was just like finishing school, right? He wasn't trying to do any big research. LSE built this big research center, and they built these, they had everyone coming through there to do, work. And he wrote this book called The Theory of Economic Policy in the English Classical Political Economy. And what he argues is that unlike the vulgar interpretation that Adam Smith was all about self-interest, Adam Smith was really about self-interest within the confines of the institutions of property, contract, and consent, and the rule of law. So all of the classical economists, from Adam Smith to John Stuart Mill, spent a lot of time talking about politics, law, society. By society, I mean the social and cultural mores of a society, and how that was able to generate the ability of individuals pursuing their self-interest to generate the invisible hand. So it's very important to understand that what the argument is about the invisible hand is that you're squaring a rational choice postulate that individuals strive to do the best that they can given their situation with an invisible hand idea, which is that in that striving, they produce an outcome which is socially desirable. But how do you get that conclusion is through institutions. Unless you have these institutions of property, contract, and consent, you can't get the invisible hand. You'll end up by being steered in a different direction, towards violence rather than towards peaceful social cooperation. So why is it that some countries are rich and other countries are poor? It's because of the institutions that they operate under. So same players, different rules produce different outcomes. Okay? So we should, as economists, study this framework. We should use our tools of economic reasoning to study the framework in which we are operating. Professor King is here. He is a student of the work of James Buchanan. That's Buchanan's major insight, and the reason why he won a Nobel Prize was because he focused all of his effort on the development of how do we examine the framework? How do we, what he called, study the constitutional environment within which we interact? And so we're going to look at economic processes always are embedded within these frameworks, and entrepreneurship, both in its arbitrage as well as its innovative character, is going to be a function of whether or not the environment encourages that behavior or hinders it. Right? So during the pandemic, I read this fantastic book by Matt Ridley. He's a public intellectual in Britain. It's called How Innovation Works. He has a great line in there. He says, "Innovation is the child of freedom, but the parent of prosperity." I just want you to forget anything I'm saying. If you remember what Matt Ridley said, I've done my job here today. Just think about that idea, the child of freedom, but the parent of prosperity. So one way to think about innovation is that for our innovative society, we have to have permissionless innovation. If for our innovations we always have to ask for permission, the committee will never give us the right to innovate. Right? They're going to say, no, don't do that, either because they don't want to have the creative destruction, which is the tearing down of the power and privilege of the existing entrepreneurs, or they're going to think, oh, no, we have to regulate this and tax it or whatever. So we need permissionless innovation. What did that give us? What did that give us? This is a miracle. This is not like just some funky graph. This is literally a miracle that saved humanity. For most of human history, we existed in extreme poverty. All right? And then all of a sudden, in the 18th century, we started experiencing modern economic growth. And that in the 18th century led to the 19th century, led to the 20th century. And look at the expansion of improvement in well-being that takes place during this period of time. Okay? So this is an amazing achievement. This is what invokes our awe and imagination as economic thinkers. Well, it makes it even more intriguing. Because look at what happens to the Western offshoots. But look what goes on in Africa. Africa is still lingering. It didn't have the takeoff. So Africa is, in fact, still lingering behind. Right? These other countries. So you have Western Europe, but then you look at the Western offshoots, and they do even better. So what do we learn from this? What do we learn from both the Great Enrichment and the Great Divergence? Well, it's a very simple lesson. But being simple doesn't mean it's simple-minded. And that is, liberalism produced the enrichment, statism produces the divergence. We must learn that lesson. The whole point of my talk is we've forgotten that lesson. All right? That's what's gone on here. So, Deirdre McCloskey, she's written this trilogy of works, and she explains what that trilogy all entails. As she says here, liberal rhetoric explains many of the good features of the modern world compared with earlier and illiberal regimes. The economic success of the modern world, its splendid arts and sciences, its kindness, its toleration, its inclusiveness, its cosmopolitanism, and especially its massive liberation of more and more people from violent hierarchies, ancient and modern. This is due to our adopting of those very liberal institutions of property, contract, and consent, and the economic growth and development that follows from it. But capitalism has a marketing problem. As any of you know that sit in here, right? For those of you who really like capitalism, it's surprising to you because people don't like it. For those of you who don't like it, you're kind of like, yeah, of course, capitalism is dog eat dog, and one of my teachers, a Russian teacher that I had, used to say the following thing. He says, under capitalism, man eats man. Under socialism, it's the other way around. But what is the problem is that we have seen an absurd increase in the lobbying efforts of government, of businesses, to get government to put the thumb on the scale to protect some businesses against others. We've gotten businesses asking that we live in a permission-based society rather than a permissionless society. Okay? So just look at the graph it's on your right there. That is the total spending from 1998 to 2022 that has taken place in Washington, D.C. Has anyone here lived in Washington, D.C.? Raise your hand. Okay. So, sir, when did you live in Washington, D.C.? Okay. So this is fascinating. So when you were there in 91 and 92, there were certain pockets of wealth, right? But it wasn't like the entire place was wealthy, right? After the financial crisis, 8 of the 10 richest counties in the United States center Washington, D.C. All right, now, for those of us who live there, we benefit somewhat from this because, for example, during the housing crisis, my house didn't go down in value. It went up because everyone comes to Washington to fix the problem, okay? But their notion of fixing the problem was more government, all right? And so it's not like wealth is produced in Washington, D.C. area. Wealth is transferred in the Washington, D.C. area, but 8 out of the 10 richest counties of America were located in that transfer world. So one of the things that's interesting, Claudia is an expert in development economics, and she can tell you about this, but one of the things that's interesting is when we look at development patterns, one of the things that we look at is if your wealth is located in your capital city, you tend to be a country that has a country of rent seekers. By that, I mean people that are privilege seekers. They want to privilege and then gather the monopoly rents for themselves. So it's more mercantilist than it is free market capitalism. There's a famous study by an economist named Andre Schleifer, where what he does is he looks at countries that have lawyers or engineers. And if you're a country that produces engineers, you're a high-growth country. If you're a country that produces lots and lots of lawyers, you're a rent-seeking country. All right? And one of the things with the lawyers is the lawyers tend to be in the capital city because that's where they work. Whereas the engineers tend to actually be in second cities. You have a capital city, but then you have another city, which is where the economic vibrancy happens. So in the United States, if you think about our history, it wasn't Washington. And no one said, oh man, I'm going to come to the United States and go see Washington, D.C. They're like, I'm coming to New York, New York City, Chicago, L.A. I'm doing something other than going to D.C., right? And D.C. wasn't the place that you thought, oh man, I got to go to D.C. to do. Now, that's where you go. All right, so, and then look at what the leading industries are. Pharmaceuticals. So this is one of the things that has Bernie Sanders all up in arms. Now, at some level, Bernie Sanders is not right, but at another level, he's somewhat right, because Moderna and Pfizer were given guaranteed contracts, massive amounts of money, and all the incentives that told all the hospitals and everything that they had to work with them. And they guaranteed it, they paid for their research. All right, so Pfizer always says that they didn't get paid for the research, but actually what they did was they got guaranteed paybacks. So in some sense, they were paid for their research. And now, the Moderna president wants to jack the price up for, the drugs. And Bernie's all upset about that because we already paid for all of these things. Now, at some level, he's wrong, because you need to have profits to encourage innovation in all these industries. And so you can't tax away the profits of these firms and then think that they're going to do, innovation. But on the other hand, if we've actually basically eliminated any competitor that they could have, guaranteed them the price of their product, right, and paid for that, well, that says something too. And that's what's going on here. So just take a look at, Claudia, I'm violating one of the major teaching rules, which is I'm telling people to look at a graph that they can't read because it's too tiny. So anyone who's here that wants the slides, please just, I know this creates work for people, but you can get the slides so you can see what I'm looking at here. But you have electronics, insurance, securities and investment, business associations, real estate, electric utilities, health and human services, oil and gas. You just go down the list. These countries are spending billions of dollars to be able to get special privilege from the government. That is, so not only do we have a marketing problem, we have a mercantilist problem, which is that businesses are going out consciously trying to get the government to give them a leg up in the competition. All right? And so we live in a rent-seeking society. All right, so what was socialism all about? Now we're going to go back in time a little bit. So first of all, socialism, that's the marketing issue, wants to argue that capitalism suffers from an inherent monopolistic tendency. You're supposed to see an increasing concentration of industry. Capitalism suffers from an inherent instability. That is, you're supposed to see more violent business cycles, okay? This inherent instability reinforces the inherent monopoly, because as the small businesses are driven out, only the big businesses are going to be the ones that can retain, and they can gobble up the smaller businesses. And that laissez-faire capitalism is a fiction, because the inherent forces at work will lead to state monopoly capitalism, and in the end, state monopoly capitalism generates imperialism and war. Right? That was the classic Marxist kind of critique, or socialist critique, of what socialism was supposed to achieve for us. And we did have serious social questions in the end of the 19th century that had to do with poverty, ignorance, and squalor. You had urbanization. When you have urbanization, you have cities and the density of population. That's going to end up by affecting health and housing and human welfare. One of the most important things here is the spread of communicable diseases, which are now because of proximity to this. You have industrial fluctuations, which are caused by factories going in and out of business, and what the consequences of that is for regimented, for labor, and the idea of the factory system generating regimented work and monopsony power. And you have a greater fear. Oh, actually, what happens is the greatest fear and the greatest resentment are kind of joined together. And when someone can do that, they create, in a marketing sense, lightning in a bottle. This is what Keynes did. He combined our greatest fear, mass unemployment, with our greatest resentment, the idle rich. Okay? Which is why it is that the key thing for him is that the savings and investment market goes out of whack. Okay? That's where everything starts to go bad. And so you have this, right, that's where the animal spirits and all the other stuff that Keynes complained about kick in. And so by doing that, combining our greatest fear and our greatest resentment, he was able to, tap into this zeitgeist. And we see people, intellectuals, doing the same thing throughout the 20th century and now into the 21st century. The same kind of criticisms, the same kind of finding of this greatest fear and our greatest resentment. And so it's not so much the landed elites anymore, but it's the billionaires, right? Bernie used to have millionaires and billionaires, but now he's a millionaire, so he just says billionaires. But he taps into that resentment. But what do economists actually say about these social ills? Were they blind to them? Well, my answer is no. As Adam Smith points out, no society can surely be flourishing and happy of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable. So Smith understood that there were social questions. His difference between his answer and more government activist answers was he thought the market was the great liberator. The market would be the tool by which we lift people up. So the economists have always asked the question, what is the most effective way to both minimize human suffering and maximize human flourishing? But the difference is economists have an understanding of constraints. We can't just willy-nilly minimize suffering and maximize flourishing unless we actually negotiate the constraints that we face in a very intelligent way. Our first constraint is against nature. We live in a world of scarcity. As the great economist Thomas Sowell likes to point out, first rule of economics, we live in a world of scarcity. First rule of politics, deny that there's scarcity. Okay? So we live in this world of scarcity. Scarcity forces us to make trade-offs. In order to make trade-offs, we need tools in the human mind to help us in negotiating those trade-offs. In a commercial society, they come in the form of property, prices, and profit and loss. That's what helps us negotiate the trade-offs. And so we have to minimize human suffering and maximize human flourishing against the constraint of nature, while coordinating distant and disparate individuals to have productive specialization, assuring cooperation among a multitude of people who we don't even know, right? I don't know how many of you have ever read the wonderful essay by Leonard Read called I, Pencil. It's a fantastic essay. If you have never read it, look it up. But its source of that essay is actually Adam Smith's I, Woolen Coat. So Smith, that's good. I'm all, yeah. You have to understand, I'm a huge Julian Simon fan, so people are the most important resource in the world. So I want more and more babies all over the place. So Adam Smith had this idea of the common woolen coat. How does the common woolen coat end up on the back of the day laborer? And then he goes through, just like the eye pencil, and tells the whole story about all the division of labor that's required by the person who's the shepherd, by the iron ore who helps build get the material by which becomes the shears by which you clip the sheep and all of these things. And so it's this cooperation among a great multitude of strangers that's scarce in our lifetime do we have to make but a few close personal friends. That's Smith's puzzle. Cooperation and anonymity. And it raises the welfare of the least advantaged. So again, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but if you go back and look at those old the data that I had about the growth rates, one of the things that David Dollar has discovered in his studies was that, sure, the rich get richer, but the poor get richer at a faster rate than the rich are getting richer. That's what the data shows. That's what the data shows. But no one wants to listen to the data. That's part of the puzzle. We economists have to do a better job communicating about what the results of our science actually teach us. So again, it's important to stress that systematic economic science in Adam Smith was a critique of the privileged system of mercantilism. And the birth of economic liberalism is in the same vein as that of political liberalism. The eradication of obstacles created by power and privilege to enable the rise of commercial society to lift humanity from misery and poverty and the subjugation by unchecked authority. This is what Smith calls his liberal plan of liberty, equality, and justice. So I want to say to young people, socialism is not the answer, because it does not and cannot work. All right? For those of you who are younger here, this is the Berlin Wall in 1989. This critical insight, the reason why socialism can't work, is because it suffers a problem of economic calculation. That economic calculation problem is very straightforward. Without private property, you don't get the exchange. Without the exchange, you don't get prices. Without the prices, you don't have the inputs into the calculation of profit and loss. Without profit and loss accounting, you're not going to be able to sort between the technologically feasible projects, those which are economically viable. That's what the functional significance of economic calculation is. It sorts from the technologically feasible to the economically viable. That's what allows us to maximize the returns on the scarce resources that we're allocating. But there's also another problem with socialism, and that problem is that in order for it to work, it has to concentrate power, and that disturbs the harmony among peoples. The organizational logic of planning is to actually give power to the man of systems, and that generates the road to serfdom, which is why the worst get on top. And we have to deal with this problem of power just as much as we have to deal with the problem of knowledge. Now here's where my talk takes the turn that I wanted to stress. So I use this sort of fancy little term here. It's called tacit presuppositions. That's a term that Hayek develops, but also Jim Buchanan develops. It refers to the things that you treat as given. So what I want to do is I want to ask you to join with me on a little thought experiment. And I'm going to travel back in time to 1979. And that's when I showed up as a freshman at Grove City College. And I want to ask you to remember in 1979, what was the experience of a 17-year-old in 1979, 18-year-old, that's sitting in a college freshman class? So the first thing that's going to come to mind is that while they were conscious, the Vietnam War had caused social disruption. All right? That Spiro Agnew was impeached as a vice president. That then the president of the United States had to forced him to resign because of Watergate. That the 1970s experienced stagflation. We had double-digit unemployment, double-digit inflation at the same time. Economic prospects were not so good. And by the way, our media, they developed Saturday Night Live. And so Chevy Chase became famous by making fun of Gerald Ford, the only real all-American athlete that has ever been the president of the United States. Does everyone understand that? Gerald Ford was an all-American football player at the University of Michigan. Not just on the football team, an all-American. And Chevy Chase made a living out of pretending as if Gerald Ford was a klutz. All right? And he made us all laugh. But everyone forgets, too, is that Jimmy Carter had these big teeth. I shouldn't say anything. He's in his last days now, and, God rest his soul and everything. But, and he's been a very good post-president person. But as a president, he was somewhat of a buffoon, right? And he had this, big chomping teeth. And then remember, he had to jump out of the canoe because the killer bunny tried to get him. Or if you might remember this, during the middle of the gas shortage, the natural gas thing, he appeared on TV with a cardigan sweater, telling Americans that he was going to unleash the Boy Scouts to check your thermostat in the winter and make sure. I'm not making this up. Go look it up. This is what he did. Okay, so as a young kid, you saw that, and these people were objects of ridicule. None of them were objects of praise. You could not imagine going to a political convention with these people and crying. Like, oh my God, look at that super person up there. They were who? Chevy Chase, flipping and flopping. That's Gerald Ford, right? Jimmy Carter, big old teeth, right? On the character, right? We made fun of him. It was like they were. So here I am in 1979. I worked a job the summer before I went to school digging pools. And there were gas lines. and I had to experience the consequences of those gas lines. And now I had my economics professor explain to me why it is that gas lines existed. And I was like, I went from a kid that was taking an economics class because I had to a kid that sat in the front row and listened to every word that professor said for the next 4 years. Every word he said, I wrote down. And every book he mentioned, I went and read. And, fell in love with economics because of the power of that. But that's because he was pushing open a screen door that was already unlocked by the events of the previous decade that I grew up with. Now, imagine I'm a freshman in 2022. What's the world that I've grown up in? All right? Communism might as well be a Charlie Chaplin film. Right? So that picture that I showed of the Berlin Wall, they have no living memory of that. Right? No one has a living memory of that except for their parents. And when their parents talk, it's like the Peanut cartoons. Wah, 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 right? They're not listening to them about that. 9/11, they weren't even born when 9/11 happened. So they don't have any memory of that. What they do have a memory of is the United States involved in a permanent war. They have a memory of a global financial crisis. They have a memory of the Occupy Wall Street movement. They have a memory of COVID-19, in which what happened to them? Their sophomore, junior year of high school was taken away from them. Right? So they think of the world as what? That the government is the corrective. They don't see the government as the bad guy. They don't see the government as a buffoon. They see the government as a good person, as there to help them. And so now it's like pushing open, as an economic educator, it's like pushing open a steel door that's been double bolted. And the question is, how are we going to do that? Because what happened was the tacit presuppositions between 1979 and 2022 switched. The taken for granted of this next generation is different than the taken for granted of the previous generation. And so that's explained by this rise of socialism and its popularity. Right? This is evidence from The Economist magazine, which looks at the popularity of socialism. And as you can see, in the United States, for example, the rise of membership in the Democratic Socialists of America has risen drastically since 2016. If you look at the attitudes towards capitalism and the attitudes towards socialism, how they've reversed in these Gallup polls. And so in the minds of these young people, markets have inequality, which is structural and systemic. We have instability, which is caused by financial and geopolitical forces. And we have injustice that we see in our political, legal, and social institutions. But what I want to say is that the answer to the dysfunctions of state interventionism is not more state interventionism. But who will be the adults in the room? Economists have actually not been very good at this. There are serious issues that need to be addressed. How are we going to affect the balance sheet of the Fed? The balance sheet of the Fed since the financial crisis has not been fixed. People don't understand what Bernanke's innovation was, which is not so much QE1, QE2, QEN. It was a thing called Operation Twist, which was the purchasing of the bonds to make sure what? That you don't have a hedge against the inflation, right, that's potentially going on, which is one of the things that he did, which is why we're dealing with all this stuff now and why Powell is having such a hard time unwinding. It's not just the COVID consequence. It's that we never fixed things from 2008. What's worse? Fiscal irresponsibility. We have a thing called the fiscal gap, which is the gap between what we have promised to pay and what our ability to pay is. Okay? Prior to COVID, the best estimates of that were that we were $211 trillion in fiscal gap. What we did in COVID was we just forgot about all fiscal sanity and just spent to try to offset this shutting down of the economy. The way to think about what we did in COVID is that we decided to follow a military model. And we thought of the United States economy as a military base. And the general said, shut it down because they're communicable disease. And then now the general is in charge of making sure that each of the units get their food. Right? That's the most extreme version of the kind of great reset that was done. Okay? Now we have regional variation and blah, 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 and all the other stuff. But that's basically what's going on. And that's a big bill. Shutting down the economy for a day is a huge bill. Imagine shutting it down for the months that we did. And it's important to point out that that did not happen under Biden. That happened under the other administration. So we've lost all sight of basically fiscal sanity and intergenerational accounting. We have to have a serious consequence of that. The third one is the rent-seeking stuff that I already just mentioned, and the idea of the pathology of privilege. There are structural distortions in our investment markets and in our labor markets that are causing the ability of the economy to provide an opportunity economy for the young in a way that we haven't had before, because we've gummed up the labor market. I'll put it in more extreme form, which is we've actually behaved like Europe. So one of the things that people say is, oh, look at Europe and they're spending on social welfare and they don't have any problems. Well, then ask them, when was the last innovation that came out of France? Right? So cheese, yeah, okay. But like, when was the last major innovation that sort of came out of France in terms of, radical seismic change, okay? And so we have this structural distortion. There's a great book by the economist Casey Mulligan called The Redistribution Recession, which is how it is that we've actually made it's so much more gummed up in our labor market so that we're not have the mobility that we once had. And that's captured in the data. You know, you might read about Raj Chetty's work on the opportunity economy and the fact that the growth, the movement between the quintiles has slowed in America, and we try to capture that or whatever. We always had different Gini coefficients than, say, the Western democracies in Europe, but we had great mobility between the quintiles. So your student today is poor, but, in 10 years they're rich, kind of in that movement. We've slowed that growth down. And that's a big question that we have to ask. Why are we doing that? My hypothesis is we're doing it because of the rent-seeking society that I just highlighted. So let me wind down here. So what do we have to do? These are names, but I hope that they resonate with you a little bit. So I had a great teacher. His name was Hans Sennholz. He introduced me to the Austrian economists, his teacher Mises and others. But it also happened to come around at the same time as Milton Friedman's Free to Choose. And Friedman had this PBS series. There's no communicator of economic basic principles that's as good as Milton Friedman from the time that Friedman wrote to today. He just was uniquely talented. He was a Michael Jordan of economics, right? He's very tiny, so he's more like Yoda of economics, but he was amazing. But what he had was this amazing ability to think and communicate with clarity and compassion to your peers, to your students, and the general public. And I want to say to young liberal political economists, to Claudia and her students, and Scott and his students, and the rest of you, that you learn from Friedman. And one of the most important things is clarity of communicating. You should be able to explain basic economics to your grandma. And if you can't, you're probably not understanding economics. Learn from Buchanan. Now, what do I like about Buchanan? Now, he doesn't write with the same kind of force and clarity as Friedman. He's a little bit pure academic-y, so he might be tough. But one of the things was he was a good old Tennessee boy. And what he didn't like was the Eastern establishment. I'm actually going to say a swear word. I apologize in advance. But one of the things he used to say in class all the time was, well, that's those Eastern establishment economists. And at first, none of us really, what does he mean by that? And then we knew it was a code word for, those are shitty economists, right? So it's like, oh, the shitty economists. Okay, now I get it. You like that? But, Buchanan was this young guy from Murfreesboro, Tennessee. He went to Middle Tennessee State, and then he went to University of Tennessee, and then he did officers training in the Navy. Now, he ended up by working for Admiral Nimitz in the Pacific Campaign. So he was not a slub as a candidate, okay? But he didn't get his selected to be the leader of his group. And he always argued it was because they gave those only to the Eastern establishment kids. right? The kids that, went to Harvard and places like that. So he always had this critique of the elitist presumptions of people who thought they were better than you and could tell you how to run your life. And that comes through in all of his work, is I'm going to put a check on those elitist presuppositions. And what he argued was that you economists, you're no better than any other citizen. Stop pretending as if you are outside of the democratic process and can tell people how to run their lives. Stop it, Paul Samuelson. Right? Stop it, John Maynard Keynes. And so when he wins his Nobel Prize, in the very first paragraph, he says, we economists must cease offering advice, policy advice, as if to benevolent despots. Stop it. That's not your business. Your business is to teach students the principles of economics so they can become informed participants in the democratic process of collective decision making. That's what we do. We don't tell people how to live. None of us are better than the other ones. We're not privileged just because we have some letters behind our name. So stop it. I think we should remember that. So Hayek, what do we learn from Hayek? Excite the minds of the next generation of thinkers with a sense of awe about the nature of the price system and the market order. And we do that with a sense of purpose about the practice of the science of economics and the art of political economy. And then I have in bold letters here, learn from Adam Smith and his kindness and generosity of spirit, as represented in his great book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, but also his analytical acuteness and historical judgment as reflected in The Wealth of Nations. And then finally, learn from Mises and his comprehensive approach to economic analysis and his courage of conviction concerning the teaching of economic science. That this science is a worthy science of the imagination of the best and the brightest, and that we need to communicate it to everyday citizens. So here's my last slide. And it's from my book, 4 Pillars of Economics, which Claudia has outside. And it's a final note. I think that economics is taught poorly. So I want to indict not the people that don't listen to economics, but the economists who don't do their job to get people to listen to them. Okay? So it's critical reflection here. Because economics is a tool for the curious. Right? It's a set of eyeglasses. This is economics, right? And when I put the eyeglasses on, the world comes in sharp relief. I can understand the most nonsensical things as actually making sense. Because I have the economic way of thinking. I understand why it is people are doing things. As Buchanan used to try to tell us, the properly trained economist with the tools of economic reasoning is able to rise to the height of an observational genius. Whereas a genius without the tools of economic reasoning will end up by speaking, mistaking noise for sense. Okay? So we need to have the tools of economic reasoning. So it gives us, it unleashes our curiosity, but it also provides an intellectual discipline for the most compassionate. We want to be compassionate and help the least advantaged, but there's a question, which is what's the most effective way to do it? We can share with Elizabeth Warren or any of the other ones their concern with the average working class person in America. In fact, we do. It's just that their solutions are the solutions which perpetuate the bad situation that those people are in rather than lifting them up. So what is it that we should be teaching in economics? Well, the first thing we should be teaching in economics is about the truth and the light of scarcity and trade-offs. This is the first thing in economics. That's the demand curve slope downward, okay? And that is like a punch right between the eyes to an 18-year-old if they learn it. It's like, boom, life has just now changed. Because all my other professors, remember, first rule of economics, they live in a world of scarcity. First rule of politics, deny scarcity. So a lot of people have been telling them there's no such thing as scarcity. Now all of a sudden, they're learning. There's no escaping scarcity. There's no escaping trade-offs. The optimal amount of anything isn't zero. Right? That's a shocking revelation once you learn that. And we ought to communicate that idea. But the second thing is we should also communicate with a sense of awe and beauty about the interconnectedness of the market and the interconnected web of the division of labor that produces that pencil. that produces that woolen coat. It's beautiful the way this system operates and self-regulates. How a revolution in Chile will lead to a spike in the copper price in New York City. And it will do so quickly and correctly. How amazing is that? It's a telecommunication system that is just amazing in its power. But economics also teaches us hope. The great fact of history, the improvement through changes in the rules of the social interaction that enable individuals to pursue productive specialization and realize peaceful social cooperation. The innovations of the entrepreneurs. In 2015 is the first time in human history that less than 10% of the world's population was living on less than $2 a day. That's extreme poverty. When I was in undergraduate school, that number was closer to 40%. Just let that sink in a little bit. Billions of people were lifted out of extreme poverty during the era of globalization. And yet we never hear about that. It's an amazing thing that happened. And economics tells us why that happened. Again, remember my simple little idea. The great improvement in mankind is due to liberalization. The great divergence between the countries is due to statism. Avoid statism, adopt liberalism, more and more people will be lifted out of poverty. And then finally, we are this tool for the compassionate. But we want effective compassion. And the way to improve the welfare of the least advantaged is through the eradication of the privileges and power through the market. The market is the great liberator. So my last thing I'll say is I want to point to a colleague of mine at the university, Emily Chamley Wright. She did her book on female entrepreneurs in Ghana. This is a dissertation work. And one of the things she talks about is how is it that women in these societies, which in fact were very restrictive, actually found their liberation through their entrepreneurship. It's how they found their pockets of freedom. Right? This is what happens with all of these groups that allow themselves to integrate into the market economy. They experience the benefits of the Great Society. And we have to teach that message to our young students so they understand, going back to ASB accreditation issues, right, that they understand that the greatest liberator and delivery for social progress is going to be what? Actually expanding markets, encouraging entrepreneurship. I lied. I said I was just going to mention Emily. I'll tell you one other story, which relates to this story that we were just talking about. I was down in Latin America about a decade ago. And I was asked to do a radio show. So it was before a podcast even. It was just a straight-up radio show. Maybe it was 15 years ago now. And so the guy on the phone says, on the radio says to me, if you met a young student that really cared about poverty, what message would you have for them? And I started out, basically saying, replicate myself, tell the story about Sennholz and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, teach them economics. They need to learn economics. And then I stopped. And I said, no, actually, that's wrong. I wouldn't do that at all. But I tell them to start a business. Start a business in your community. That's how you would help eliminate poverty. Start a successful business in your community. Hire people and, and do that. And there's a great book by the sociologist William Julius Wilson. And William Julius Wilson asked the question, what happens when work disappears? And what he studied was all kinds of communities where work disappeared. And then what happened to those communities? They get leveled out. So what we need to do is basically communicate what the consequences are of entrepreneurship, not just on the individual who enriches themselves, but on the community that gets enriched by the fact that we have an expansion of entrepreneurial opportunity. And when we do that, then we'll be able to successfully counter a lot of these trends that are currently going on. So anyway, thank you very much. I greatly appreciate your attention. And I guess we're going to take questions. Is that what?
Yes, we will have time for Q&A. So thank you, Pete. I had to come back up for the mic. All right. Anybody have some questions for Pete? He's kind of, anything's possible at this point.
Yes, hi there. I thoroughly enjoyed your lecture. I am a Bernie Sanders fan, so just to set the field correctly.
Yeah.
Anyway, so what is your feeling about, the social safety net, the importance of it?
So I think the question again is, what is the most effective way to have a social safety net? And I think that one of the things that that modern economic growth allows us to do is to be able to have more cushions that we provide. And so what we have to do is we have to have an imperative on the ability to grow. This is true for all of my answer would be the same for all of the social tensions, meaning, for example, if you ask me how do I deal with the environment, the best way to deal with the environment is have technological improvement and wealth. And the more and more wealth that we have, the more we have resources to be able to address the serious problems of, climate change or whatever we have. And so it's all about allowing the market to liberate, to be able to provide the resources that can address serious problems that we have. And so that's how I would, and what I worry about is not I don't know, where your fandom of Sanders lies. It doesn't matter. What matters is that I actually share a lot of his criticisms of crony capitalism, right? That is the political capitalism where you put the thumb on the scale to protect some interest groups at the expense of others. Hayek, in the Constitution of Liberty, has an idea of what he calls the generality principle. Buchanan ran with that as well, which is that no law shall be passed which benefits some group at the expense of other groups. So the only laws that could be passed are those that meet a generality norm. That is, if it benefits you, it benefits everyone else. And we live too much in a special privileged economy, all right, which benefits a lot of people. So when Bernie Sanders or AOC or any of the other people raise these questions about crony capitalism, I'm like, yeah, right on board. In fact, if you remember when she was first elected and she came to Washington, she had this hearing and she was talking about interest groups. And she gave probably one of the best talks that a public choice person would give if she understood what public choice was, about the benefits of interest groups, and all of that. So, but where do I think Bernie goes wrong? So I think he wants to, kill the goose that lays the golden egg. That's one. So I don't like that. But I also think he preaches, like Trump did, against trade and migration. And I think that's a huge problem, for someone that cares about the least advantaged. Because what we know is that the greatest welfare improving policy for the world's poor is to allow them to migrate. Right? But that's the evidence that we have. If we allow them to migrate, we are actually allowing them to enrich themselves and their families. And so if we really want to address the issue of poverty, one of the things that we should allow is a much more free migration of individuals around the world. And so the fact that both Bernie and Trump decided that they think that that's a bad thing, I think is they don't know the facts. And so I would disagree with them on that. So I'll tell you a funny Bernie story, though. This is when he ran for president many years ago, the first time. There was a student, I was asked to give a talk at a university, and a kid that sat up in the front, and it said, "Feel the burn." All right? And you remember those T-shirts? And so the kid says to me, after I get done talking and I answer some questions, he stood up and he did like a shake right in front of everyone. And he goes, "Do you feel the burn?" And I started laughing. And I go, "No, I don't feel the burn, but do you ever know that any other time that you would say something like that, I feel the burn, it would be a bad thing rather than a good thing? Like, I feel the heartburn. That's not good, right? I scraped my knee. I got, that's a burn. No, that doesn't feel good. So there's no other time that we would ever say, "Do you feel the burn?" and it would lead to you dancing. So maybe you should think about that. That's what kids say.
We still have time if anyone else has another question. Oh.
Yeah, teacher voice. Mike Frankie, I'm a history teacher for high school seniors, first, second year college students.
Wow.
As we end the semester, one of the things you said at the very end, I struggle with how to look forward at this, the end of work. How is that technology, self-driven trucks, all of that? What do you see in your crystal ball as populations increase and work maybe decreases and becomes more automated?
So again, I don't want to be simple-minded on this. Okay, but we have had technological innovations, going all the way back in time. And each time we've had them, people have said this was going to happen. right? So this is what's called Ludditism, right? So you have a new technology, let's shut that down because it's going to put everyone out of work. And so right now the claim is that the robots are going to put us out of work, right? And the issue is that, well, someone's going to actually have to learn how to fix the robots. And, there's going to be new industries that are all involved that are connected with the whole thing with the robots. Now, let's say that Kurzweil is right and we can have a singularity moment. And what will happen is then economic growth will go like this, right? And then we'll all be able to be on vacation. So if we could put the robots to work and growth would be like this, then we could actually pursue more of our hobbies and things like that. But I don't see that happening. I think we still are going to live in a world of scarcity. We're going to face trade-offs. And each one of these industries, as they innovate, they create 5 other industries that are also going to have to innovate around them to be able to supply them. So one question that you might push me on, which is what Charles Murray focuses on, which is that in order for that kind of robotics work to be done, you have to be a certain type of cognitive capacity. And his argument is that during our industrial phase, we didn't compete on cognitive capacities, we competed on the strength of our backs. And so that middle class Americans, a guy that was a lower middle class could become high middle class because of the strength of his back and working like at the steel factory or whatever and moving up. And his claim is that we're not going to be able to do that now because this creates a different style of cognitive capacities. I don't know that I have an answer to that in a very convincing way. I'm not sure that I believe what he says about that, but I could see why someone might say that. But I think we get smarter over time. There's a difference between being book smart and actual practical smarts. And for example, I'm at awe of a car mechanic, right? If I'm a product of modern civilization, which is that I have 0 skills of survival. So one of the things I always point out to everyone is that there is not a time in human history that I would go back to. And the reason for that is I'm pretty sure I would be dead within 24 hours in most of them. So if I went back, you don't have modern medicine, I'm going to knock myself into something and scrape myself against a rusty pipe and then I'm dying, or whatever. And so to me, I am completely a benefactory of the refinements of division of labor. And I think that the refinements of division of labor can go in a variety of ways, and there's not going to stop them with robots either. And I think people are going to be able to learn trades and other kind of things. So I have faith in that. It is a faith. But it's a faith grounded in looking at past evolutions of technology. So, but, we're hearing a lot about robots going out now. We have very, very smart economists, Darren Acemoglu, who's now obsessed with this issue and working on it. My colleague Tyler Cowen is another one. He thinks we're all going to go out of work because we're going to have chat GBT and it's going to, substitute for all of us economists. To me, these are all tools. Technology is a tool. Human beings are the ones that are the important inputs to the tool. Yeah.
All right.
How do you see the whole debt and deficit and unfunded liabilities thing playing out 25, 30 years from now when the deficit has just become the sole focus of the national budget?
Yeah, so this is the adult conversation that I want to encourage in our country and in among my profession. So in the 5th book of the Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith argues that there's a governmental habit. And the governmental habit is to run deficits, accumulate debt, and then debase the currency. And he argues that the least honorable and the least honorable and the most detrimental is to what he calls engage in that juggling trick. He calls it a juggling trick. And in many ways, from Adam Smith all the way up to John Maynard Keynes, economists understood the problem of the juggling trick. And they warned against the juggling trick. And they trained people to think that you shouldn't engage in a juggling trick. And what Keynes did in his transformation of economics was to say, I can train economists to be master jugglers. Now, it's not just Keynes, it's Keynesianism that did that. So it's not Keynes himself, but Keynesianism. And that became the idea that you use the budget to balance the economy, not to worry about balancing the budget. And then the question is, why would any politician run surplus? So the idea was you'd run surpluses in times of plenty, and then deficits in times of recession, and over the life of the business cycle, you would balance the budget. But the question is, what are the incentives of politicians face to run surpluses during times of plenty? And so what you end up by having is a permanent deficit economy. And that's where we're at now. So how are we going to get out of that? We have this deficit, we have this accumulated public debt. So in the last decade, there's arisen a set of ideas called modern monetary theory. And that has influenced a lot of people on, some in Washington. And I think it's monetary crankism. So I don't think it's actually a viable answer to this issue, right? Which is basically we could print our way out of the problem without having the consequences of inflation. And I just don't think that's the case. If we try to print our way out of this, we're going to end up in hyperinflation, okay? So what are we going to do? Now, let's get real about what this is going on. So Lawrence Kontlikov, who's a professor at Boston University, has written a lot and broken this down. It's called the intergenerational gap. He actually wrote the original paper on that under the Clinton administration. And it was for a Democratic administration as a Democratic economist. And he now runs for president trying to tell people, about what's going on with this intergenerational accounting stuff. But here's the thing. We could cut spending by 40%, and we could increase the marginal tax rate by 40%, and we still wouldn't get rid of the fiscal gap. That's the situation that we're in right now. So the reality of our situation is that we are Greece. The issue is that we're not Greece because we are the most attractive economy in the world. So we're able to live with a lot of our stupidity because we still attract dollars or any other currency into this country. We are a $1 trillion economy with 330 million people. We could actually increase the population of the United States by 100 million and not even bat an eye in terms of the land mass that we have over this whole area. We could be a fuel economic growth in an amazing way. And that's attractive to people around the world. And, when you're running away from a bear, doesn't matter if you're the fastest. What matters is that you're faster than the other one. And so the other places are not attractive. Now, I was a specialist in the Soviet economy and studied the transition economies throughout the 90s and into the early 2000s. And if you go back and just look up a little thing called foreign direct investment. And one of the major things in that was in Russia, during the 1990s, it was just constant capital flight. People wanted to get whatever they had over there out of that country as fast as possible because they had no credible commitment that they could actually retain their investments. And as Claudia can tell you, one of the really important findings in development economics is that if you have foreign direct investment, so if you have foreign aid, but your country can't attract foreign direct investment, all the foreign aid in the world is not going to help your country. Okay? If you are a country that attracts foreign direct investment, foreign aid augments your development. But you have to be a country that can attract foreign investment. And so that off-puts a lot of things, but that doesn't kick us, that just kicks the grenade down the road some more. And that's what we've been allowed to do. So I think we have to come to a reckoning, and one of those reckonings may be repudiation. And repudiation is not an easy thing to go through. But it might be the only thing that we're able to get out of the mess that we're in. But that would be that would be a breach of democratic trust, and people would have to be, there'd have to be some real serious politics of that. Like you'd have to grandfather some people in, but tell people when they're 20, you're going to have to pay in your whole life, but you're not going to get anything out, or all these other kind of things. But otherwise, we're going to be in real serious issues So the Reinhardt and Rogoff book, This Time is Different, you know, again, we were only able to kick the grenade down the road because of various things, but they're right about the debt to GDP ratios. These are not sustainable. Not sustainable at all in history. So we're in trouble.
We have time for one more question if anyone would like to ask Pete.
And I will say the following thing about that. I think, and again, I'm subject to refutation on this, but I think the most important lesson that if I was trying to communicate to students about the dire nature of all this is to have them read a book by Jim Buchanan called Democracy and Deficit, which is about the fiscal legacy of Keynes, and to have them read a book by F.A. Hayek called Tiger by the Tail, which is the monetary legacy of Keynes. And it's the combination of those two that I think explains the mess that we're in. And the fact that the mainstream of economics, those are 2 Nobel Prize winners in economics, the fact that the mainstream of economics does not teach Buchanan and Hayek the way that I think they should is part of the reason why we as an economics profession can't have a serious conversation about that issue.
Thank you, Pete. And thank you guys for coming.